So I spent my summer doing what most fun people do during the summer, which is reading books about post-slavery Mississippi, because who likes the beach, right? Anyway, I am a certified Faulkner glazer in a way. Such a fan of the previous two books of his that I've read, which would be As I Lay Dying and Light in August. And so this summer, I set out to read two of his most notoriously difficult and acclaimed works, The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, Absalom. And I have many thoughts on these books. So I want to talk about my experience with reading Faulkner broadly, and I want to talk about some of the books in specific. I won't be able to go super in depth because I don't want to spoil these books, and also it could literally take days to go over even certain sentences in these books. I mean, they're really that dense. I'm hopefully going to be able to give you a taste of what his books are like, the level of difficulty that you'll encounter with each book, where I think you should start with Faulkner. Hopefully give you an idea of if these books are for you. Because they're not for everyone, I wouldn't say. But also, I think anyone can enjoy them to a certain extent, with certain caveats. So firstly, I want to talk broadly about my experience reading Faulkner's work. A couple years ago, I read my first Faulkner book, which would be As I Lay Dying. My very first video on this channel is my favorite books of 2022. What else topped the book list but As I Lay Dying about William Faulkner? And I proclaimed this about the book back then. As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner is my new favorite book. This book is absolutely phenomenal. It can be very difficult, but not in a way where you need all of this prior information going into the book. Difficult in a unique way, in a way that the book kind of teaches you how to read it. Mystery and its challenge are part of the charm and part of the fun of this book. And honestly, I stand by it. I can't think of another book that has really stopped me in my tracks and blew me away. But I don't think that'll be everyone's experience reading this book, because it is super weird, experimental, and it's sad. There's some humor to it as well, but it's not like The Office or something. Like it's not going to make you belly laugh. Then the next year I went on to read Light in August, which is this big chunky book. It's the longest book of his that I've read so far. It might be his longest novel. I'm not sure about that, though. But this one is much more straightforward. This one doesn't have some of the confusing stylistic elements that the first one does. The only real barrier to entry for this book is that it's very sad, depressing. As I Lay Dying is depressing, too, but this one, I think, had a more overwhelmingly, depressive atmosphere. When I was reading it, I was enjoying it, but I dread picking it up because there's no light. Ironically, in this book. It's very, very dark and dreary. So this summer, as I said, I set out to read The Sound and the Fury and Absalom, Absalom. And I also read a short story of his, a very famous short story called A Rose for Emily. It's so confusing sometimes. First, let's talk about difficulty. I want to explain that if you are having trouble understanding what's happening in the books, it's intentional, but he won't leave you in the dark forever. While initially things may seem like complete nonsense, I encourage you just to keep going. I have this theory that if you don't finish one of his books, you will hate it. Absolutely. Because all it is going to be confusing with no explanation whatsoever. If you finish one of his books, you will understand what's going on. At least broadly. Obviously, there are going to be some complexities that you have to kind of think over, parts you have to go back in the book and think, oh, what was this part about? All of the earlier parts of all of his books are illuminated the further you go into it. The prime example of this is The Sound and the Fury. The first chapter is practically nonsense, narrated by someone who's mentally disabled. The second section of the book plays with the chronology of events, and it's a different character, and he is going between the present and the past in his mind, and it swaps the present and the past with italics and uses sort of different stylistic ways of doing flashbacks. But it's presented in a way that you might not understand that right out of the gate, and the language is very abstract. The third section of the book is very clear, and it's from the perspective of a different character. I think when you get to his section of the book, a lot of the questions that you have for the first two sections will be totally answered, or at least mostly answered. And then going into the fourth section of the book it's like a third-person omniscient narrator. At that point, your questions regarding like what's going on should be pretty answered. And if not, you can always go back through the book, and I think if you read it again, the answers will be there for you. Which leads me into my next point, is that Faulkner's books are begging to be reread. And while I haven't reread any of his books, I have gone through sections of the previous books that I've read just to clarify certain things or get more out of it. The books are really perfect for that. I mean, I can't think of another author whose books I'm more compelled to read a second time, because I'm not much of a rereader, and also to really sit with it and think about what you've just read. This is not the type of book that the person who's trying to read 100 books in a year and they just try to fit in The Sound and the Fury. This is not going to be a book that they're going to enjoy in that same way. This is a book that you really have to sit with, and you have to really contend with and think about and even discuss with people. I took on the challenge of reading these books with a friend, and while he didn't love them as much as I did, he did enjoy them, and it was fun to discuss our theories about the books, our interpretations of certain scenes, and the themes that are being presented. And I'm making it sound more academic than... Well, they are academic, but they're also just really enjoyable. I mean, I wouldn't just read this to bully myself. I get pleasure out of reading books that have a lot in them. These books aren't that long, small books, but each page is packed with so much. You can spend 10 minutes on one page just reading it and rereading it. It's taken me longer to read Absalom than it would to read, like, I don't know, a long Murakami book or like a long fantasy book, because you can't passively read it. You can't just fly through it. That's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but let me give you a good place to start.
It's so confusing sometimes.
Firstly, I think Light in August is a very good place to start with Faulkner. I also think A Rose for Emily, the short story that I read, is a good place to start. They're more traditionally written. They don't have the same stream of consciousness style that he employs in a lot of his other books and that he's kind of known for. Light in August focuses on a number of different characters, the main one being this guy, Joe Christmas, who has a sort of obscure racial identity. He may be part black. He probably is. The townspeople don't really know how to represent him either. And remember, this is all post-slavery United States in the South. So obviously it was more preferable in terms of like fitting in to the culture and not being bothered to be white. A very good introduction to the themes that he talks about in the other novels regarding the South, regarding racism, identity. Next, personally, I don't know if this is contentious or not, I would go with As I Lay Dying. As I Lay Dying is about a family who's trying to transport the mother's corpse, and everything goes wrong. Storms have like blown out the bridges. The characters have conflicting feelings about their mission in general. It's not as hard as The Sound and the Fury, I don't think. It's sort of more abstract. It's shorter, first of all, which is nice. And every chapter is narrated by a different character. I don't know if you can see it, but it says Darrell, and then it's Darrell's speaking, and it changes every chapter, and the chapters are only like 4 pages long a lot of the time, so it gives you nice checkpoints to give it a break for a day. But I found this book to be really fun. After As I Lay Dying, I would go to The Sound and the Fury. The Sound and the Fury is about the Compson family and the different boys in the Compson family dealing with the sort of degradation of their family's name, loss of purity, quote unquote, in the eyes of the South, the soiling of their legacy, the destructive hatred that they display. Then after The Sound of the Fury, I would go with Absalom, because this was the hardest one for me. Absalom is a story about this man, Thomas Sutpen, who creates this huge plantation in the middle of this town in Mississippi. Nobody really knows where he came from. Nobody knows his backstory, but he essentially creates this empire. It's like framed narratives inside framed narratives where the main character is being told the story about Thomas Sutpen by one character, then told different pieces of the story by another character. The person that's listening to the story has to piece those two perspectives together to figure out really where the truth is. Because the people who are telling that story are coloring it with their own feelings. Broadly a book about the subjectivity of history. I was just swimming in confusion, but a lot of the confusion, I was like, I can't tell if this is my fault and I'm just reading badly and like he said something that I missed, or if it's because he purposefully left something out. Whereas in The Sound and the Fury, I felt more like I could understand when he was deliberately obscuring things from me. With Absalom, I was like, maybe I'm just bad at reading. So that made it a bit harder to get through. And also, a bulk of the book takes place in the past, so it doesn't have sort of the immediacy of something like The Sound and the Fury or As I Lay Dying or Light in August. Really, you can start anywhere, but like I said, I would go Light in August, As I Lay Dying, The Sound and the Fury, Absalom, or start with A Rose for Emily, which is like 14 pages. I just read it off a PDF online, but it's not as stylized as any of his novels are.
It's so confusing sometimes.
Now, how would I rank these books in terms of personal enjoyment? This is incredibly difficult for me, for 2 books in particular. I don't know if I can pick one over the other, but those 2 books would be As I Lay Dying and The Sound and the Fury. Those are my favorite Faulkner books that I've read so far. I just love the style of both of them. I love the constantly shifting styles. I got so much out of the themes of these books in particular, which I can't really talk fully about without spoiling some of it. I love the themes about the South's despisal, is that a word? Or fear of losing its purity in the wake of the New South. Something that's mentioned in the book is that purity is literally just an idea. It's just a word. These characters get so hung up on maintaining this like legacy and preserving their name and the way that they approach the world. And that leads to really destructive and harmful things, both interpersonally and to others. I really just resonated with the message of this one the most. As I Lay Dying is just like fun to me. It engages with some philosophical ideas about the nature of like your relationship to certain titles. We place certain values on things because of like a title, what avenues that can lead a person down and what decisions that can lead you to make. I'm being purposefully a little bit vague because I do want you to read these books. Next, I would go with Absalom. This book was wonderful, but it was hard to get through until after probably the 7th chapter of the book where things become more clear. It takes 7 chapters to get to the point where you start to really fully understand what's happening. I was just largely confused most of the way through. But then 7th chapter to the end is like one of the best reading experiences I've ever had. It's so good. So yeah, like I said with Faulkner, stick with it. You'll really get something out of it. Then I would go with Light in August, which is actually my friend's favorite of the books that he read. You know, maybe I'm wrong and this is his best work. I have no bad words to say about this. The only reason I didn't love it as much as the other ones is because of the lack of the crazy style, and because I felt like when we got to a different character, the momentum was a little bit hampered. It's a little bit more forgettable for me than his other books. Still a great book. Still love it. And then I'd probably put A Rose for Emily at the very end, just because it's not as involved and not as layered. And, you know, it's a short story, so it just doesn't have the scope of his novels, but still a great short story. I mean, in terms of short story writing, it is like a masterclass in really creating a full world in 14 pages.
It's so confusing sometimes.
Now, who would I recommend Faulkner's books to? Anybody that likes a bit of a challenge. Dark Souls fans. I kind of think of Faulkner as sort of the Dark Souls of literature, which I know is such an overused metaphor, but it's because his books are tough, but they're fair. You will get more out of it the more you go into it, which is so rare. Books that offer this much to you, especially in this page count, I can't think of another author whose books I feel like I'm constantly being drawn back to with this magnetic ferocity. That being said, I wouldn't recommend reading them all in a row. They do take a lot of your mental capacity and a lot of your reading time if you're really trying to read deliberately. I would recommend this also to people who like books about the South. Fans of Steinbeck, I think, will enjoy this. All that I hear about Faulkner is people comparing Cormac McCarthy to Faulkner. So if you like Cormac McCarthy, check out William Faulkner. You'll probably enjoy it. You know, I've only read The Road by McCarthy, and I'm planning to read some of his other books very soon, but because that comparison is made so often, I feel like it's worth mentioning. His stuff is so reminiscent to me of stuff like Ulysses, which I haven't read in its entirety. I've only read like 10 to 15 pages in a bookstore like a couple times, but the stream of consciousness style is present in his work and also in Ulysses. Faulkner's books are almost like a puzzle, but a purposeful puzzle, one that's not just mental, but it's also emotional, and it works with the story that he's trying to tell. I don't think he could have told these stories any other way and have them have the same impact. You won't get the same impact reading a Spark Notes list of the events of The Sound and the Fury as you will just picking up the book and reading it, because it's so experiential. He really puts you in the person's mind. He's not being just deliberately confusing for the sake of it. It is bringing you in exactly to those feelings and those sensory experiences. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have read these books, let me know what you think of them. If you hated them, let me know why. If it's been a while since you've read him, I'd encourage you to give him another shot. I never had to read him in high school or in college or anything. I chose to do this to myself. I could imagine if you were to, pick up The Sound and the Fury in school, you would never actually read that. Like, you might get a couple pages in and be like, I'm Spark Notesing this, and you would be robbing yourself of the experience that these books have to offer you. That's my Faulkner Summer experience. If you have any recommendations for me based on the books that I like, please let me know in the comments. Specifically for McCarthy, my friends are big McCarthy fans, and they have different ideas of where I should go next with him. I know Blood Meridian's a big one, but would I enjoy Blood Meridian? I don't know. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, Faulkner's Brat. The end.